Welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm back today again with yet another conversation about Chapter 1 of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, if you recall, in the previous conversation, we had reached a point in reading the book where he is talking about the kind of psychological relationship, the psychology of the oppressor-oppressed relationship, where he talks about as to how the oppressor's relationship to the oppressed is sadistic, right? Now, in today's reading, he briefly first explains what he means by that. And then he goes on to invoke and talk about yet another constituency in this struggle, right? In this struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors. And this is the constituency that breaks away from the oppressing class and joins the oppressed, right? Now remember, these people figure prominently in all revolutionary theorization, in decolonization, as well as in Marx, the question of where would the loyalties of the petty bourgeois lie, right? And he goes on to explain what kind of problems they will have if they do not change their consciousness. These people who have left the dominant group and have joined those who have risen against the oppressors. And then towards the end of today's reading, he will talk about, the violence amongst the oppressed themselves, right? How is it that the natives, the peasants, sometimes are so extremely violent to each other, right? Take it out on each other, and that will help us explain these stereotypes that are mobilized against African Americans in United States, against the native people of India, Pakistan, and elsewhere. What the British used to say, oh, these people are terrible to each other, right? All of these things become clear in this reading today, right? So I'm going to stop here and go to the screen recording of the reading and then come back and we'll talk about it a little more. So here we go. The pleasure in complete domination over another person or other animate creature is the very essence of the sadistic drive. Another way of formulating the same thought is to say that the aim of sadism is to transform a man into a thing, something animate into something inanimate, since by complete and absolute control the living loses one essential quality of life, freedom. Sadistic love is a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness and its necrophilic view of the world is thus sadism. As the oppressor consciousness, in order to dominate, tries to deter the drive to reach the restlessness, to search the restlessness and the creative power which characterize life, it kills life. More and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose. The maintenance of the oppressive order through manipulation and repression, the oppressed as objects, as things, have no purposes except those their oppressors prescribe for them. Given the preceding context, another issue of indubitable importance arises. The fact that certain members of the oppressor class join the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, thus moving from one pole of the contradiction to the other. Theirs is a fundamental role and has been so throughout the history of this struggle. It happens, however, that as they cease to be exploiters or indifferent spectators or simply the heirs of exploitation and move to the side of the exploited, they almost always bring with them the marks of their origin, their prejudices and their deformations, which include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. Accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malefic as that of the oppressors. The generosity of the oppressor is nourished by an unjust order which must be maintained in order to justify that generosity. Or converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trusting the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without their trust. Those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. This conversion is so radical as not to allow of ambiguous behavior, to affirm this commitment, but to consider oneself the proprietor of revolutionary wisdom, which must then be given to or imposed on the people, is to retain the old ways. The man or woman who proclaims devotion to the cause of liberation, yet is unable to enter into communion with the people, whom he or she continues to regard as totally ignorant, is grievously self-received. The convert who approaches the people but feels alarms at each step they take, each doubt they express, and each suggestion they offer, and attempts to impose his status, remains nostalgic towards his origins. So the passages I've just read start from yet another deeper explanation of the oppressor-oppressed relationship, right? Which is, according to Freire, a sadistic relationship. And of course, he is going through like a certain specific understanding of sadism. And if you look at it, I mean, even like in traditional sense, a sadistic act is aimed at controlling another body and seeing it completely submit, right? And that's the consciousness that the oppressor inhabits. In the process, you know, what he's trying to say is that people and their bodies become objects because it's the writ of the oppressor that must be written upon them, right? That's why that relationship is sadistic, and that's why love of that kind is also sadistic, a love that constantly must objectify the other or the beloved or the person with whom you have a relationship. Then he goes on to theorize one of the most important aspects of revolutionary politics, and that is the role of the petty bourgeois, right? That was prominent in Marx as well, because the question, first of all, was where would they stand? Like the shopkeeper, the business managers, these people who were not the workers, not part of the proletariat, but probably not also part of the dominant group. And their loyalties were always, in question. But it was important to know where would they stand in a revolutionary moment, right? And Freire is creating a space here to include those people who might have previously been part of the group of oppressors, right? But might move in solidarity from their privileged status to the cause of the oppressed. And it's really crucial to understand that role, because in our everyday politics, even today in American streets, not understanding that can damage any movement, right? Because if we are fighting for race rights, right, if we don't understand that gestures and participation by people who apparently might look like they are part of the oppressive class, we cannot foreclose the revolution to them, right? We have to include them. But what is there in this text instructive about the consciousness of the people who have just left the house of the masters and joined the oppressed is that they are still caught within the logic, the way of thinking, the psyche of the oppressor, right? So they might have joined the people, but they have this nostalgic view of their own past, but also their way of thinking the world is managerial. it's still connected to where they come from. So then what they tend to do is they tend to appropriate the revolution, right? And how do they do that? By becoming cautionary, by telling people, oh, we must not do this, we must not do that. And all of those suggestions are proffered and offered for the success of the revolutionary movement, but they are not informed by the feelings and experiences of the people that they are joining, right? So what Freire is absolutely certain about is that these people are acceptable within a peasant movement and other movement, but they should come with humility. They should come to work with the people, to learn from them, and not to impose their own worldview and their own way of doing things on the people. People will express themselves in solidarity with each other as they see fit, as is constructed through their learned experience, right? And so, but these passages give us an understanding of any kind of revolutionary praxis, that it must have a space for those who want to come and join it, right? Even though if they were part of the oppressor group, right? So it creates that possibility, it doesn't exclude them, right? But it also tells us to be extraordinarily aware of the incipient and maybe unconscious loyalties and ways of thinking of this group. This group is in an ambivalent space. They've just left the life they had always known, but they have not yet learned to think things through the way the oppressed think, right? Meanwhile, as we are already learning in these lectures, that the oppressed are also learning to dislodge the master's discourse from their souls, right? But these passages teach us, that these converts, they will have problems. They might try to hijack or overtake the movement or try to guide it according to what they think is right, but they need to be cognizant of the fact that this revolution is led by, thought by, and practiced by the oppressed themselves. So this is not just out of thin air that Freire is pulling it out. I mean, if you look at all the major revolutions, towards the end of every revolutionary movement, a cadre of the oppressor group does join the fight, right? It happened in the French Revolution, right? It happened in the American Revolution. It happened in Afghanistan, post-Soviet war. But what ends up happening is that these people who join the revolution late most of the times then get to set the agenda, right? And in a way then appropriate a populist movement to their own ambivalent agendas. And that is what Freire is trying to teach us about, to keep in mind in any kind of revolutionary praxis, right? And to remember that these people who have just joined you, they might be welcome, but their souls carry the imprint of the system that they have just left, and it just can't immediately be erased, and to be cognizant of that. So that's kind of my take on these two passages. There was a footnote 13 here. As you read it, you will see that he's quoting One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, and I do suggest you read it. I will go ahead and read a few other passages now. I do apologize that my recording system has kind of given up on me, so I'm using my phone to record these lectures, so I may not be able to put up the text on the screen, but I hope that you can follow it. So I will read the next couple of passages and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So going on, conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic way of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. One of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed, who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor whose image they have internalized. Accordingly, until they concretely discover their oppressor and in turn their own consciousness, they nearly always express fatalistic attitudes towards their situations. So this is an instruction to the newly converted to the movement, right? Is to understand that just as they have left the house of the master and joined the movement of peasants or workers, right? They have a lot of learning to do. The most important thing that they need to learn is to unlearn their own way of thinking, right? And through comradeship and companionship, learn the way of thinking and practicing of the oppressed themselves. 2, also keep in mind that the oppressed are also trying to fight the system that created their consciousness. We already talked about it in the earlier discussions of the text, is that the world that in which the oppressed are rising is the world dictated, scripted, and created by the writ of the oppressor. And that is the logic that the oppressed had internalized, that duality of they themselves, but also the imprint on that soul is that of the oppressive system. So the fight, first of all, is to dislodge that system from your own soul, from your own consciousness, and then come up with new revolutionary praxis, right? So while the converts are coming to this constituency, they should try to learn to be like their oppressed brothers and sisters and learn their ways of thinking, but also keep in mind that the oppressed themselves are constantly still fighting the deep system that had etched on their souls, right? The writ of the oppressive system. And then Freire gives us a quote from a peasant that he had interviewed, right? The peasant begins to get courage to overcome his dependence when he realizes that he is dependent. Until then, he goes along with the boss and says, what can I do? I'm only a peasant. This is that fatalistic way of thinking, right? If you have internalized the logic of the powerful system around you, then the question of changing it never really emerges, because you have somehow agreed that this is your space in this world, right? So the first change must come in realizing that you are oppressed. And we talked about it in the previous discussions, right? And then finding a way of undoing that. So fatalism then is always a part of group or individual consciousness when you cannot imagine a system outside of the one in which you live, or when there is no hope, or when you're isolated and individual, right? And as he will go on to tell, religion plays an important role in it. Any kind of ideology that tells you you must suffer through and do what you're told makes you fatalistic, because you transport the result of your life to either a hereafter or to a future time and hope for history to fix things. And anyone who believes in praxis and revolutionary politics would tell you is that history doesn't really solve things. It's people's actions that change things. So that's where he is going with it, right, in this part of the chapter. So I read on. When superficially analyzed, this fatalism is sometimes interpreted as a docility that is a trait of national character. Fatalism in the guise of docility is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of a people's behavior. It almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune, inevitable forces, or to a distorted view of God. Under the sway of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially the peasants who are almost submerged in nature, right, because they work with the land, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. So this is, his reading of fatalism, but distinguishing that fatalistic thought is not essential. No group is born as a fatalistic group, right? The fatalistic behavior, this belief that things are the way they are, is socially constructed, right? Socially engineered. I mean, think of it, and who essentializes fatalism? I mean, think of the colonizers. Famously, the British, when they talked about the Kashmiri people, they would consider them, there was a term used for them which was called zulm pasand in Hindi and Urdu, which literally means that these are the people who love cruelty. So they had essentialized the behavior of people of Kashmir Valley as people naturally docile, anyone can conquer them. And in the last 20 years, we have learned that no, given the right set of circumstances, the same docile people will rise against their oppressors and fight them to death. So there is no natural docility, right? But most of the times the oppressive system would posit a group identity of such sort on this people, right? Religion plays a huge role in creating fatalistic thought, right? If you tell people this is your station in life, and that if you perform the duties, whatever God tells you to do, you will have a wonderful hereafter or a wonderful rebirth, or Jesus will come and save you. All of these are, the opiates, as Marx would say it, that encourage people to not to try to change things because maybe religiously you think God has already ordained it, or materialistically you think this is how the world is, this is an unjust world, fighting against this injustice is futile, let's just live our lives in it. And another form of fatalism is where people will say, well, I'm not concerned with politics, I just want to take care of my own family and my own children. And that is another form of fatalism, which tells you as long as I can take care of these few people, I'm doing okay with life. So what does fatalism do? I mean, fatalism forecloses any possibility of revolutionary change, right? It forecloses any possibility of coming together in solidarity, talking to each other, learning from each other, and saying we need to change things. Because if you're fatalistic, you cannot imagine change, because you have internalized this idea that things are the way they are naturally. But what he's also trying to teach us in this passage is that fatalism is not essential. People are not naturally fatalistic, human beings especially, but even animals are not fatalistic, right? Otherwise they won't venture out when there is a drought and try to find a greener pasture, right? They even believe in action, right? But these are some of the things that he's talking about, how, people can be fatalistic. Right? I read on, right? And we are on page 62 now. Submerged in reality, the oppressed cannot perceive clearly the order which serves the interests of the oppressors, whose image they have internalized. Chafing under the restrictions of this order, they often manifest a type of horizontal violence, striking out at their own comrades for the pettiest of reasons. And this is where Freire is going into explaining the internal violence within the oppressor class. And this is something extremely important for us to learn, because most of the times the oppressor groups essentialize these violences. Under these Africans, they have been just killing each other for centuries. If you look at Israel-Palestine conflict, the same phrase is used. Oh, these people have been fighting for centuries. Muslims are violent by their very nature. Hindus are fatalistic. All of these, and within the American context, even the President of the United States sometimes would lead you to believe that somehow African Americans are naturally violent to each other, right? They keep killing each other. Here is where he is trying to now explain how does internal violence emerge in minority groups, in oppressed groups. And what he's trying to teach us is that this violence, where the natives, the minorities, the peasants, the oppressed, turn against each other is the very product of the system that has created those inequalities. And please do keep in mind, right, there's a lot of Fanon over here. I don't know if he read Fanon or not, but when Fanon explains violence, right, the native violence against each other, this is the same logic. The injustices of the colonial system combined with the psychological trauma is what creates that subjectivity. The same argument is also offered in so many other circumstances under colonies, where men who felt powerless within the public sphere would turn on their own families, right, in their households, because they felt empowered. The idea is not to forgive that violence, but to offer a genealogy of it. What creates a situation in which people who should otherwise be comrades turn against each other and become violent to each other. That is what he's trying to explain in these next paragraphs, and I think it's really important for us to learn that and understand that. And I will come to it in my next conversation with you on this topic, and I hope by then I will have my system sorted out and I'll be able to produce a better quality of video. But anyway, that's all I have today. If you have any questions, concerns, please send them my way and I'll try to answer them. As always, I'm grateful for your time, and please take a few moments and do subscribe to the channel. Also, we now have a learning website, masoodraja.com, which I've been trying to promote here. Please visit the site and see if you can support us, see if you can take some free courses. That would help this channel and help my cause a lot. Thank you so much for all of your help. I will now see you next time, and until then, as always, peace and love.